I still remember the smell of polished wood in that lawyer's office. The room was silent, heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. My children sat beside me, but it felt as though an ocean separated us. My son leaned back in his chair, smirking like a man who had already won. My daughter crossed her arms, her eyes fixed on the floor, avoiding me as if I were some stranger dragged into the room by mistake. And then the lawyer cleared his throat. "According to this document," he said, tapping the papers with his thin fingers, "you are not entitled to a single penny." Those words hit me like a hammer to the chest. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. Not entitled. After everything I had built, after all the nights I came home covered in soot and sweat, after decades of sacrifice, my heart thundered in my chest. My hands trembled, gripping the edge of the chair so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I turned my head slowly toward my son. He didn't even try to hide the satisfaction in his eyes. His lips curled into a half smile that told me everything. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a plan. My daughter finally raised her head and met my gaze for half a second, then looked away. Shame flickered in her eyes, but not enough to stop her. At that moment, I understood something that froze my blood. My own children had conspired to erase me. They hadn't just betrayed me. They had calculated it, step by step, with cold precision. I could almost hear Margaret's voice echoing in my memory, my late wife. The woman who had shared every hardship and every dream with me. "Promise me, Elaine," she had once said on her deathbed, "that you'll take care of yourself, even when I'm gone. Don't let anyone trample on you." And here I was, sitting in a room where the people I had given my life for now sat plotting my erasure. The lawyer kept reading, but his voice became a blur. Words floated in the air. Signed documents, transfer of assets, exclusion clause. None of it made sense. All I could hear was the pounding of my heart, the cruel laughter in my son's smirk, the silence of my daughter, who had once clung to my leg as a child and begged me never to leave her. I wanted to speak. I wanted to shout, but my throat tightened like a knot. The humiliation was unbearable. To be stripped of dignity in front of strangers. To see my children treat me not as a father, but as an obstacle in the way of their greeted, was worse than death. My mind drifted to the nights I had worked double shifts at the factory so my son could go to university. I remembered pawning my wristwatch, the one gift my father had ever given me, just so my daughter could have a proper dress for her graduation. Every sacrifice came back to me in a wave that crashed against the walls of that office. And now, they wanted me discarded, erased from the very legacy I had spent my life building. The lawyer placed the paper flat on the table and looked at me with rehearsed sympathy. "I'm sorry, Mr. Harrison," he said softly, "but this is what the documents state." My son leaned forward, his voice dripping with arrogance. "It's better this way, Dad. You wouldn't know what to do with the money anyway. We'll take care of things. Take care of things." The words slithered into my ears like poison, as if I were some frail old fool, incapable of thought, as if I hadn't built every brick of the house they grew up in with my bare hands. I stared at him, silent, and for the first time in my life, I felt something inside me shift. I had always been patient, always forgiving, always willing to believe that blood was thicker than water. But in that instant, something broke. I realized that I wasn't just fighting for money. I was fighting for dignity, for Margaret's memory, for the years that could not simply be written off by a forged signature or a smug smile. The room blurred for a second, but not from tears. It was from the fire burning inside me. I thought of all the times I had swallowed my pride, all the times I had been told to step aside, to be quiet, to accept less than I deserved for peace, for family, for love. But this was beyond forgiveness. I leaned forward slowly, my old bones protesting with each movement, and placed my hand on the table. My voice came out low, but steady. "Is that so?" I asked, my eyes fixed on my son. He nodded confidently, certain he had already won. My daughter shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The lawyer, unaware of the storm brewing inside me, adjusted his glasses and prepared to move on to the next clause. But I wasn't listening anymore. My mind was already racing back to a discovery I had made just days earlier, something they didn't know, something they never expected. And in that moment, even as humiliation threatened to swallow me whole, I felt the faintest flicker of power return. They thought they had cornered me, stripped me of everything, but they had made one grave mistake. They underestimated me. I sat back, folded my trembling hands in my lap, and let them think they had won. The game wasn't over, not yet, because what they didn't know was that I had discovered the deception at the very last second, and I was about to turn the tables. When I left that lawyer's office, I carried more than papers and humiliation. I carried memories that weighed heavier than any fortune or inheritance. If I am to tell you this story, you must understand where I came from, because betrayal only cuts this deep when you know how much was given in love first. I was born in the narrow backstreets of Leeds, long before the city was polished with shopping centers and modern glass towers. My earliest memories are of cold mornings, when my breath hung in the air like smoke, and the sound of coal carts rattling down the street was the closest thing we had to music. My father was a stern man, broken by years of factory work. My mother did her best, though most nights we went to bed with little more than bread and dripping. Poverty wasn't a word to us. It was simply life. At 12 years old, while other boys still played football in the alleys, I was already working. The factory floor became my school. The hiss of steam and the clanging of metal, my lessons. My hands hardened, my lungs filled with dust. But in those years, I learned resilience. I learned what it meant to fight hunger with work, to fight despair with determination. And in the middle of that gray life, there was one bright light, Margaret. She was the girl from the bakery, the one who always slipped me a roll when she thought no one was watching. Her laugh was warm, her eyes kind, and when she smiled at me, I felt for the first time that maybe life could hold more than hardship. We married young, perhaps too young by today's standards, but back then, love was enough to build a future on. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and that was wealth in its own right. The first flat we lived in was drafty, with wallpaper peeling at the corners and floors that creaked under every step, but Margaret made it a home. She could turn a potato into a feast, a single candle into warmth. When our first child was born, my son and I felt a kind of pride that words cannot capture. I looked at him and swore I would give him everything I had never known. 2 years later, my daughter came into the world, tiny and fragile, with eyes that mirrored her mother's. From that moment on, my life had purpose. Every decision, every sacrifice, was made with them in mind. I worked double shifts at the factory, often returning home with hands too blistered to hold a fork properly. But when I opened the door and saw Margaret rocking the children, or my little boy running to greet me with arms wide, all the exhaustion melted away. I lived for those moments. I believed that if I endured enough, my children would never have to taste the bitterness of want. Money was always tight, but Margaret and I managed. There were times when I skipped meals so the children could eat, times when we pawned wedding gifts just to keep the rent paid. Yet I never complained. I told myself that a father's role was to carry the weight silently, so his children could walk lighter. As the years passed, the world around us changed. Factories closed, machines replaced men, and finding steady work became harder. But I refused to give up. I cleaned floors, carried bricks, even worked as a night guard when no other job would take me. There was no shame in honest labor, at least. That's what I believed. What kept me going was the dream of a better life for my children. I wanted them to have education, to walk into rooms with confidence, to never feel the sting of poverty's brand. And so, every extra penny went toward their schooling. I denied myself small pleasures, new clothes, holidays, even the thought of retirement so they could have the future I had once only dreamed of. I still remember the day my son received his acceptance letter for university. He stood in the doorway, holding the envelope with shaking hands, his face lit with disbelief and joy. I cried that day, though I tried to hide it. It felt like every blister, every aching muscle, had been worth it. When my daughter graduated from secondary school, I insisted she have a proper dress. We couldn't afford one, not really, but I sold my father's old wristwatch to pay for it. It had been the only gift my father ever gave me, and though I treasured it, I knew she needed that moment more than I needed the memory. Seeing her smile as she twirled in that dress, I told myself it was a fair trade. Margaret was my anchor through it all. She reminded me to laugh, even on the hardest days. She patched my clothes, held my hand, and whispered to me when the world felt too heavy. We built our lives brick by brick, with patience and sacrifice. By the time our children were grown, I believed we had succeeded. I thought I had given them a legacy of love and resilience. I thought they would look at me with gratitude, perhaps even pride. But time has a cruel way of revealing truths we don't want to see. When Margaret fell ill, the children visited at first. They brought flowers, sat at her bedside, and spoke in hushed voices. But as her illness dragged on, their visits grew shorter, their excuses longer. My son always seemed busy with work, my daughter with her social life. I told myself they were coping in their own ways, but deep down, I felt the distance growing. The day Margaret passed, my world collapsed. I had lost my partner, my compass, the one person who truly saw me. And though my children stood beside me at the funeral, their eyes were elsewhere, already drifting away from me. In the months that followed, I tried to cling to them. I invited them to dinners, offered to help with their own children, but there was always a wall. They treated me politely, but without warmth, as though I were a relic of the past, an obligation rather than a father. Still, I told myself love would endure. I convinced myself that blood was enough to bind us. I swallowed the small insults, the moments of neglect, because I believed that someday they would remember who I was, what I had given. But standing in that lawyer's office, hearing those words, "You are not entitled to a single penny," I understood the bitter truth. They hadn't just forgotten my sacrifices. They had erased them, and the father who had carried them on his shoulders through poverty and hardship was now, in their eyes, nothing more than an obstacle to wealth. When Margaret passed away, I thought the children would draw closer to me. I imagined that grief might knit us together, that shared sorrow could soften old distances. But the opposite happened. It was as if, with her gone, the thin thread holding our family together snapped completely. At first, I tried not to notice. I excused their absence, their rushed phone calls, their distracted faces. They have their own lives, I told myself. They're grieving in their own ways. But grief, I came to learn, reveals more than it hides. And what it revealed was a truth I had ignored for years. My children no longer saw me as a father. They saw me as a burden. It began subtly. My son, who once looked up to me like a hero, started speaking to me with impatience. He would interrupt me mid-sentence, roll his eyes at my stories, or brush off my advice with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Dad, times have changed," he'd say, as if my words belonged to another century, useless and outdated. My daughter, sweet once, began avoiding me altogether. When I visited her home, I felt like an unwelcome guest. The warmth of childhood hugs had been replaced with forced smiles and quick glances at the clock. Her children, my grandchildren, barely knew me. They treated me like a stranger who came and went without much importance. I remember one particular Sunday. I had prepared a roast, the way Margaret used to. I invited both of them, hoping to recreate even a fraction of the family dinners we once shared. I set the table carefully, polishing the old cutlery, folding the napkins just as Margaret used to do. I even wore my best shirt, though it hung loosely on me now. They arrived late, both of them, arguing before they even stepped through the door. My son complained about traffic, my daughter about her schedule. They sat down, glanced at the food, and muttered, "You shouldn't have gone through all this trouble." But they ate quickly, barely tasting it, their eyes glued to their phones more than to me. At one point, I tried to tell them about a memory, how Margaret used to sneak extra potatoes onto their plates when they weren't looking. My voice cracked with emotion, but they weren't listening. My son interrupted me with, "Dad, did you pay the gas bill this month? You can't forget these things at your age." My daughter chimed in, "Honestly, maybe we should manage these things for you. You'll get confused." I sat there, silent, as they talked about me as though I weren't in the room. They didn't see me as capable, as wise, as the man who had raised them. They saw an old man, fading, weak, a problem to be solved. The disrespect only grew worse. One evening, after dinner at my son's house, I stood up to wash the dishes. Margaret had always taught me that leaving dirty plates for others was impolite. But my son stopped me. "No, Dad," he said, and for a fleeting moment, I thought it was kindness. Then he added, "You'll probably drop something and break it. Just sit down." It wasn't kindness, it was contempt. Another time, at my daughter's house, I reached for a slice of bread at the table. She looked at me, frowning, and whispered, "Dad, you really should watch how much you eat. You don't move much anymore, and it's expensive to keep buying so much food." Her words cut me deeper than any knife could. To be told, after decades of sacrifice, that I ate too much, as if my existence was measured in pounds of bread and cost of groceries, it was humiliation wrapped in polite cruelty. Even in my own home, I began to feel like an intruder. My son would show up unannounced, walking through the rooms as if they were already his. He would open drawers, make notes of things, sometimes even take papers without asking. "Just keeping things organized," he'd say. But I knew better. He was cataloging, preparing, making sure he missed nothing when the time came. The breaking point began to take shape in small moments, like the evening when my daughter told me bluntly, "You should sell this house. Dad, it's too big for you, and honestly, you don't need all this space. You'd be better off in something smaller, maybe a retirement home." I looked around the house, the walls where Margaret and I had marked the children's heights, the kitchen where we'd shared every Sunday meal, the garden where I had built a swing for them. Every corner was soaked in memories, in love, and sacrifice, and they wanted me to give it up, just like that, as though it were nothing but a piece of real estate. Their words echoed long after they left. Retirement home. Burden. Too much food. Too big a house. Outdated. Confused. Each word piled on top of the last, until I felt crushed beneath their weight. I tried to push back, gently. I reminded them of the sacrifices Margaret and I had made, of the struggles we endured. But instead of gratitude, I was met with irritation. My son said, "Dad, stop living in the past. No one wants to hear your stories anymore." My daughter added, "It's exhausting when you bring up how hard you had it." We all struggled, but they hadn't struggled not the way we had. They hadn't gone to bed hungry, hadn't worked until their hands bled, hadn't pawned their only heirloom for a school dress. They had lived easier lives because of us, because of me and Margaret. Yet they dismissed it as if it were nothing but noise. And still, I swallowed it. For months, I endured the little cuts, the sharp words, the silences. I told myself it was temporary, that perhaps they were stressed, that love would return if I just waited. But with every visit, every dinner, every interaction, I felt myself becoming smaller in their eyes. There's a saying that death doesn't change people, it reveals them. I believe now that Margaret's death revealed what my children truly felt. With her gone, they no longer bothered to hide it. Their respect had died with her. And as the weeks turned into months, their contempt turned into something more dangerous. They began managing my finances for my own good. They insisted on handling my paperwork to make sure I didn't get confused. They even started speaking to neighbors and friends on my behalf, as if I were incapable of holding a conversation. The worst part wasn't what they said, it was what they didn't say. They never once said, "Thank you, Dad." They never once said, "We love you." They treated me not as family, but as an obstacle standing between them and what they wanted. And though I tried to convince myself otherwise, deep down I knew the truth. The respect, the love, the gratitude, it was gone. By the time I sat in that lawyer's office, hearing the words that stripped me of everything, I wasn't even surprised. The cruelty hadn't started there. It had been building, piece by piece, word by word, action by action, until betrayal was no longer a shock, but the natural conclusion of years of disdain. And yet, knowing all of this, living through all of this, didn't make it hurt any less. Because no matter how strong a man is, there is nothing that wounds deeper than the realization that the people you sacrificed everything for no longer see you as family, only as a nuisance standing in their way. Every storm has its moment, the one clap of thunder that shakes the earth, the one lightning strike that changes the sky forever. For me, that moment came on a cold November evening, when the rain hammered the roof and the wind howled through the cracks of the house Margaret and I had built together. I had been living alone since she passed, clinging to the remnants of our life, trying to keep our traditions alive. On that night, I set the table for one. I cooked a small stew, the kind Margaret used to love, and placed her photograph on the chair opposite me. Just as I often did when the loneliness became too sharp, I whispered to her, as though she were still there, telling her about the weather, about the ache in my knees, about the grandchildren I barely saw anymore. Halfway through the meal, there was a knock on the door. It was my son. He stepped in without waiting for me to invite him, shaking the rain from his coat. His expression was hard, businesslike, as though he were entering an office rather than his childhood home. "Dad," he said flatly, "we need to talk." I gestured toward the table. "Sit down. There's food. You look cold." He shook his head. "No, this won't take long." His words sent a chill through me, colder than the rain outside. He walked into the living room, glanced around at the photos on the mantelpiece, weddings, birthdays, Margaret holding the children when they were small. He sighed, almost with irritation, and then turned to me. "This house is too big for you," he began. "You can't manage it anymore. You're alone here, and it doesn't make sense. We've found a retirement home. It's clean, safe, and you'll be looked after. You should move there." For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. A retirement home. This house wasn't just bricks and mortar. It was the cradle of our lives, the place where Margaret's laughter still seemed to echo in the hallways. I stared at him, my throat tight. "This is my home," I said quietly. "Your mother and I built our life here. Every memory we ever made." He cut me off with a sharp gesture. "Dad, you're being unreasonable. You can't keep living like this. It's selfish. Think of us. We can't be running back and forth worrying about you." Selfish. The word hit me harder than any blow. I, who had worked until my body was broken so he could study. I, who had given up dreams, hobbies, even my health, for his sake. And now, I was selfish because I wanted to stay in the home I had built with his mother. I tried to argue, but my voice cracked. "Your mother wanted me to stay here. She wanted me to hold on to this place." He sighed again, this time with open frustration. "Mom isn't here anymore. Stop using her as an excuse. You're old, Dad. It's time to face it. Old, weak, burdened." Those were the words between his lines. I sat down heavily in Margaret's chair, clutching the armrest as though it could keep me anchored. My heart pounded in my chest, and for the first time in years, I felt truly powerless. Then came the moment I will never forget. My son pointed toward the garage. His face was cold, without even a flicker of compassion. "If you insist on staying here, fine, but the bedrooms are needed when family visits. From now on, you'll sleep in the garage. It's warm enough. We'll put a mattress there. It'll be easier for everyone." The words hung in the air like poison. The garage, the place where I kept my tools, where the air smelled of oil and dust, where spiders crawled across the concrete floor, the place unfit for any human, let alone a man who had built the very foundation of their lives. I looked at him, searching for some trace of the boy who used to sit on my shoulders, laughing as I carried him around the garden. But he was gone. In his place was a man hardened by greed, blinded by entitlement, deaf to love. I wanted to shout, to rage, to throw him out of my house, but instead, I felt my body go numb. My voice came out as little more than a whisper. "If your mother could hear you now." But he didn't flinch. He simply shrugged. "Mom's not here, Dad. It's just us now. Accept it." That night, I carried a blanket to the garage. My hand shook, not from the cold, but from the weight of humiliation. I lay down on a thin mattress they had placed on the floor, the smell of damp concrete filling my lungs. I pulled the blanket over my shoulders and closed my eyes, but the tears wouldn't stop. In the darkness, I spoke to Margaret. "I'm sorry, love. I failed. I thought raising them with love would be enough. I thought they'd remember the sacrifices, but they don't. They see me as nothing." I cried silently, ashamed even of my own grief, as though admitting the pain made me weaker. The garage walls echoed with the sound of my sobs, and I realized I had never felt more alone in my life. Days turned into weeks, and the humiliation became routine. Whenever my children visited, they walked through the house as though it were theirs. making plans for changes, for sales, for futures that didn't include me. I stayed quiet, retreating to my corner in the garage, trying to convince myself that peace was worth the silence. But inside, something was breaking. I had endured poverty, hunger, exhaustion, and loss. I had faced a world that tried to crush me, and I had stood tall through it all. But nothing, not hunger, not pain, not even death, had wounded me as deeply as being cast aside by my own flesh and blood. I had always believed that family was sacred, that no matter what, blood would bind us together. But that night in the garage, I learned the harshest truth of my life. Sometimes, blood can betray you more cruelly than any stranger. It was my breaking point. I no longer recognized my children, and perhaps they no longer recognized me. I was no longer their father, their guide, their protector. To them, I was an old man, a nuisance, a burden to be hidden away in the shadows of the garage. And yet, as I lay there in the darkness, one thought flickered in my mind, like a candle refusing to die. They think they've beaten me, but they're wrong. The humiliation was unbearable, but beneath it, a spark of defiance began to glow. I had lived my whole life fighting against the world. Why should I stop now? What my children didn't know, what they couldn't even imagine, was that the story wasn't over. Not yet. The garage had become my prison. The days blended into one another, marked only by the faint light seeping through the cracks in the door and the distant hum of life inside the house I had once called my own. I slept on a thin mattress laid across the concrete floor, the smell of oil and dust clinging to my clothes. Each night, I listened to the footsteps above me, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, and I wondered how my children could so easily forget that the man exiled below them was the very reason they had a roof over their heads. But life has a strange way of whispering hope in the quietest moments, and mine came one afternoon when I least expected it. I had been sorting through a box of old tools when I found a small wooden chest covered in dust. Margaret had once tucked away keepsakes in it, birthday cards, dried flowers, even a few letters we had exchanged during our courtship. My hands trembled as I opened it, and there, buried among the papers, I found something I had forgotten existed, an envelope marked with Margaret's delicate handwriting, "To Elaine, for when you feel lost." I froze. My heart pounded, as though Margaret herself had called out to me. Slowly, I unfolded the letter inside. Her words were like balm on a wound I had thought would never heal. "My love, if you are reading this, it means life has grown heavy, and the world feels too cruel. But remember, you are stronger than any storm. You built this family with your bare hands, with sweat and sacrifice. Do not let anyone, not even those you love, make you believe you are less than you are. Hold your ground, protect your dignity, and if ever they forget who you are, remind them, with love, always. Margaret." I pressed the letter to my chest, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something shift inside me. It was as though Margaret herself had reached into the darkness of the garage and lit a single candle. That night, I didn't cry. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, Margaret's words echoing in my mind. "Remind them who you are." The very next morning, I decided to do something I hadn't done in years. I walked to the library in town. My children rarely checked on me during the day. They assumed I was too feeble to go anywhere, but I still had strength in my legs, and I refused to let them cage me completely. At the library, I began to read, not novels, not poetry, but books on property law, inheritance, rights of the elderly. My eyesight wasn't what it used to be, so I squinted at the fine print, sometimes reading the same paragraph 3 times before the meaning sank in. The librarian, a kind woman with silver hair, noticed me struggling and offered to help. When I told her, haltingly, why I needed the information, her eyes softened with understanding. "Don't let them take everything from you," she whispered, sliding a pile of books toward me. "You have more rights than you think." For weeks, I returned every day. I scribbled notes in the margins of old notebooks, cross-referenced laws, and pieced together the picture of what my children were planning. They weren't just trying to move me to a retirement home. They were maneuvering to take ownership of the house, the land, and even my small savings. They wanted it all, and they were counting on my silence, on my brokenness to succeed. But they had underestimated me. One afternoon, as I was gathering my notes, the librarian leaned closer and said, "You don't have to fight this alone. There are organizations that defend people like you elders who are mistreated, cheated, silenced. You should speak to them." The thought terrified me at first. To expose my own children to the scrutiny of strangers felt like betrayal. But then I remembered the night my son told me I belonged in the garage. The betrayal had already happened only. It wasn't mine. I made an appointment with a local solicitor. He was a young man, barely older than my grandson, with sharp eyes and a quiet confidence. When I poured out my story, expecting disbelief or pity, he instead leaned back in his chair and said, "You have a strong case. If what you say is true, your children could face serious consequences. We'll need evidence, documents, witnesses, anything you can gather. But you are far from powerless." Powerless. That was the word I had carried in my chest for so long, the weight that had bent my back and silenced my voice. And here was someone telling me that I was not powerless at all. That evening, I walked back to the house with a new fire in my chest. The garage no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a war room. My notebooks, Margaret's letter, the solicitor's card, they became my weapons. I began to watch my children more closely. I listened when they thought I wasn't paying attention. I noticed the way my son spoke about liquidating assets on the phone, the way my daughter sighed impatiently whenever I dared to enter the living room, the way their spouses whispered about money as if I were already dead. They had forgotten that the man in the garage was the same man who once stretched every penny to keep food on the table, who had survived a world far harsher than any of them could imagine. One evening, when they gathered in the living room to discuss plans for downsizing, I quietly turned on the old tape recorder I had used decades ago to capture Margaret singing in the garden. From my corner in the hallway, I recorded every word of their conversation. They spoke of selling the house, of splitting the money, of putting me in a facility as soon as possible. Their words dripped with greed, devoid of any hesitation. And as I listened, I felt something inside me crystallize. This was no longer about humiliation. It was about justice. The next morning, I returned to the solicitor with a recording. His eyebrows shot up as he listened, and he smiled grimly. "This," he said, "is more than enough to begin. They cannot force you out. They cannot touch this house without your consent. And if they try, the law will not be on their side." For the first time in years, I stood taller as I left his office. The autumn wind was sharp against my face, but I welcomed it. It reminded me that I was still alive, still standing, still capable of fighting back. That night, in the quiet of the garage, I unfolded Margaret's letter once more. "Do not let anyone make you believe you are less than you are," she had written. I smiled through tears. "I won't, love," I whispered into the darkness. "Not anymore." My children thought they had silenced me. They thought they had buried me in shame. But they had done something far more dangerous. They had awakened the part of me that refused to bow. The twist of fate was not that they betrayed me. The real twist was that in betraying me, they gave me back my strength. And soon, very soon, they would learn exactly what that meant. I had spent weeks gathering courage, evidence, and quiet determination. The garage, once a place of shame, had become my sanctuary of planning. Margaret's letter rested under my pillow, my constant reminder that I was not broken, not defeated. The solicitor's voice echoed in my memory. "You are far from powerless." For the first time in years, I believed it. But believing was one thing, facing them was another. And that moment came sooner than I expected. It happened on a damp Tuesday evening. The sky outside was swollen with gray clouds, and the rain fell steadily against the windows. I had just returned from the solicitor's office, with more documents in hand, when I heard raised voices in the living room. My son Richard was pacing back and forth, his voice sharp with irritation. My daughter Anne sat stiffly in the armchair, her arms folded. Their spouses lingered nearby, whispering in tones that carried both greed and impatience. "We can't delay this any longer," Richard snapped. "The longer he's in the house, the harder it'll be to sell. The market is good now. We have to act." And sighed. "You make it sound easy. He's stubborn, even in his old age. If we push too hard, He might start asking questions. I stood at the doorway, listening. My heart pounded, not with fear this time, but with something else, anger. Yes, but also resolve. I could no longer afford silence. I stepped into the room. You mean questions like these? I said, holding up the folder of documents I had gathered. The room went still. All eyes turned to me. For the first time, I saw not pity or casual disregard in their expressions, but shock. Richard froze mid-step, his mouth slightly open. Anne's face drained of color. "What are you talking about, Dad?" she said, her voice wavering. I walked further into the room, my cane tapping against the wooden floor. "You think I don't know what you're doing? You think I don't hear the whispers, the plans, the schemes to put me away and strip me of everything I built? I may be old, but I am not blind, and I am certainly not powerless." Richard scoffed, recovering his composure. He forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Dad, come on. You're misunderstanding. We only want what's best for you." I raised the recorder in my hand and pressed play. Their voices filled the room, the exact words I had captured. Talk of selling the house, splitting the money, putting me in a facility. Their own voices betrayed them. Anne's hands flew to her mouth. Richard's face flushed with anger. His wife muttered something under her breath and turned away. I let the recording play to the end before clicking it off. "That," I said, my voice steady, "is not love. That is theft, betrayal, greed, and I will not tolerate it any longer." For a moment, silence hung heavy. The rain outside seemed louder than ever, drumming against the windows as though the heavens themselves bore witness. Finally, Richard lunged forward, his voice rising. "You set us up. You've been spying on us, recording us. How dare you? How dare you?" I countered, my voice stronger than I expected. "How dare you forget the man who raised you, who worked his body to the bone so you could live in comfort? How dare you treat me like garbage, like a burden to be discarded? You speak of selling this house as if it were yours. Let me remind you, it was my hands that laid the foundation of this family. It was my back that broke so you could eat. This roof belongs to me, and I will not be pushed out." Anne's eyes filled with tears. "Dad, it's not like that. Not like that." I cut her off. I heard every word. "Don't insult me further by pretending it was for my good. Do you know what it feels like to be told by your own son that you belong in the garage? Do you know the humiliation of being treated like an unwanted guest in your own home? If Margaret were alive, she would weep at what you've become." The mention of her name sent a shiver through the room. My children shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting away. Margaret's memory was sacred, even to them, and I had invoked it with all the weight of truth. Richard clenched his fists. "So what now? You think you can fight us? You think the law will side with you?" I stepped closer, close enough to look him directly in the eye. "I don't think it. I know it. I've spoken to a solicitor. I've learned my rights, and I have proof of your intentions. If you try to take one more step against me, you will not only lose your inheritance, you could face charges." The words hung between us like a blade. For the first time, Richard's confidence cracked. His eyes darted to his sister, then to his wife. Anne fidgeted with her sleeve, her face pale. "You've changed, Dad," Richard muttered bitterly. "No," I said softly. "I haven't changed. I've remembered who I am. You mistook my silence for weakness. But silence is not weakness. It is patience. And my patience has run out." The confrontation stretched late into the night. They tried excuses, justifications, even tears. Anne begged me to understand that they were under pressure, that life was expensive, that they only wanted security. But each word rang hollow against the truth of what I had heard. I did not raise my voice again. I didn't need to. My strength was no longer in shouting, but in standing firm. I told them plainly, the house was mine, the will was intact, and any attempt to manipulate or pressure me further would end in court. When at last they realized I would not bend, they retreated to their rooms, leaving me alone in the living room. I sank into Margaret's old armchair, exhausted but unbroken. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like an intruder in my own home. I felt like its guardian again. The days that followed were tense. The air was heavy with unspoken words. Richard barely looked at me. and avoided my gaze. Their spouses whispered in corners but never challenged me outright. They knew the balance of power had shifted. One evening, as I sat in the garden Margaret had once tended, I realized something profound. The confrontation had not only changed their perception of MIT, had changed mine. For too long, I had accepted humiliation as my fate, thinking I was too old, too weak to resist. But in standing up to them, I had reclaimed more than my house. I had reclaimed my dignity. The path ahead would not be easy. I knew greed did not die overnight, but I also knew that I was no longer alone. I had allies, the solicitor, the law, even Margaret's words, from beyond the grave. And most of all, I had myself. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, I whispered into the fading light, "I did it, Margaret." I reminded them. I reminded myself, and in that quiet moment, I felt her presence beside me, warm and proud. The confrontation was only the beginning, but it was the moment I turned from victim to victim.